stop Tony Abbott from getting one-party control of the Senate. And that's something we're going to say so many times throughout the election that we're going to get sick of saying it. But it is really important because for the first time in a long time, Canberra has a real chance, not just to host our politicians, but to actually make an even larger impact on the national stage. All my life I've been a campaigner for the community. And in my role at GetUp, I had the interesting journey of witnessing the growth of the far-right movement in Australia. And I'm sure we've all noticed that in the last few years. And so interestingly enough, when we talk about the Americanisation of Australian politics, these days we are referring to the importing of Tea Party-style organising. The reason I think tonight's important is because we're going right to the source. The reason the Tea Party grew was in response to the Obama campaign, in response to what we in Australia now call the Obama organising model. And that's why I'm really excited that tonight we're going to have that conversation right at the source. It's just not about navel-gazing tonight, though. It's more than that, because I hope tonight that we can also question the pathway we're on, explore it, and commit ourselves to it. To progress our positive vision for the future, as I said earlier, we know we need to stop Tony Abbott controlling both houses of Parliament, and therefore we know that here in the ACT, we need to knock off a Liberal Party centre. Now, I would use the name of that Liberal Party, but it's very difficult at this stage to know who that would be. We have a positive vision for the future. We know we want to protect the carbon price, the renewable energy target, grow that target, and invest far more in clean energy. We know we want to spread the wealth of the mining boom around to more people and grow the industries of tomorrow. We know that we want to treat single parents fairly. We know we want to treat asylum seekers fairly. But none of those things will be possible if Tony Abbott has total control of the Senate. So how are we going to stop it? Well, we know here in the ACT, as Richard said, it's the most marginal Senate race in the country. And that means we have to shift about 1,500 voters away from the Liberal Party. It also means we have to enrol about 6,000 new voters. And we can do that. We've already started. In just 2 efforts in the last couple of weeks, we've already enrolled over 400 new Green voters, which is absolutely fantastic this early in the campaign. And I see many people in the room who've either been enrolled, or someone smiling as if they haven't enrolled yet, or who've helped us in that task, and I'm really grateful for that. Here's the interesting things. Here are a few interesting things. The research shows that the best way to speak to this audience, that 1,500 audience, is not through the Canberra Times or through 666. Undecided voters, swinging Liberal voters, they're out there getting on with their lives, not consuming as much media as perhaps others who are more rigid in their political views. And that means that we have to do volunteer organising, grassroots organising, door-to-door campaigning, ringing up voters, going to shopping centres, all the things that just so happen to be the best way to talk to voters anyway. And that's why I'm really excited about this evening, because already there are more people who've committed to volunteering on this campaign than voted in the Liberal Party pre-selection. We're already a people-powered movement that's going to change this election, and that's why I'm really excited that tonight we'll get to hear from Ilya. Thank you for coming and thank you for carrying this movement.
So one interesting thing in the States that you guys don't have here is to find the spy, you just look for the 6 people in the back with the video cameras, who will then follow you out through the hallway to the restroom and everywhere else you go, which is a piece of American politics I hope we don't ever export to Australia. So thank you, Richard. Thank you, Simon, for the invitation. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I think I'll keep this relatively brief, mostly to have time for questions and talk about sort of whatever it is you want to hear about. But just to put a little texture on the very generous intro that was put together for this. So I'm actually a community organizer. I got my start outside of Chicago, organizing to improve the quality of public education in Illinois. So bringing together community leaders at house parties, talking about the school system, developing from the ground, building power to make legislative change. And after sort of a number of roles, I worked for then Senator Obama. He was a senator from Illinois. I worked in the Chicago office. Also had some part in the 2008-2012 campaign. And now work at MoveOn.org, where I'm the National Mobilization Director. MoveOn is sort of the sister organization of GetUp, with about 7 million members all across America. The difference being we engage directly in electoral work in the States in a way that GetUp doesn't, sort of because of the way the Australian electoral system is structured. But as Richard mentioned, the other interesting perspective I bring is I actually was, like Simon, a candidate for the US Congress just a couple of years ago from my home district, which is outside of Chicago, where I ran in a Democratic primary. Unlike Australia, we primarily have a two-party system. We make the best of it. And had the experience of not just organizing sort of on issues, but also building power for the purposes of winning elections and making fundamental change at the national level. And so I wanted to share a couple lessons because although I think our electoral systems are vastly different, besides the party piece, certainly you have compulsory voting, which adds a little element of interest to campaigns. And also, I found out today you have letterboxing, where you can put things in mailboxes, which oddly enough is actually illegal in the States. Presents an interesting challenge. But besides that, I think the core principles of how you build power, how you organize, how you persuade people to support a candidate, how you hold those votes in the face of all sorts of negative campaigning, and how you get them out to the polls to make sure that you win, are fundamentally similar wherever you go. And so I want to talk about two lessons that actually are most prominent from the Obama campaign, but actually are decades old in the States and are tested and proven. They're the ones Simon touched on, which involve organizing. So the first one is organizing around story. So if you think about President Obama, and you think about sort of his first run, one of the things you'll know is sort of what Rich just talked about. He's the community organizer from Chicago with a funny name, right? That's sort of what people knew about him. And that was an intentional choice that I carried through in my campaign, and one of the pieces to get organizing. The reality is the reason people organize, the reason people participate, is very personal and unique to each person, right? Each of you has a reason you are here. And so one of the techniques we use in the States to organize folks came from a professor named Marshall Gans, who talked about organizing around story. A story that consists of three pieces. The story of self, who I am, why I'm here. Why each of us has one of these, right? So in my case, my family had moved to the States as Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union. We had a whole story of working our way up, getting support from a community and government to achieve, to live out what we call the American dream, but certainly every culture has their own. So I had a personal story that I could share with folks, a story that connected, that resonated, that people understood. That's the first piece, the story of self. The second piece is the story of us, because as Simon just talked about, all of us are in this room for a shared reason, right? We all have a shared set of values. So believing in opportunity, believing in equality, believing in shared sacrifice and shared responsibilities. All these things make up a shared narrative of why we're here together, the story of us. And finally, there's a story of now, the reason that us taking action in this particular moment becomes so critical. So in the US context, in 2008, we were looking at the end of 8 years of George W. Bush, a climate in peril, an economic crisis like we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. In this case, you find yourself in, as Simon has aptly reminded me, the most marginal district in Australia that could literally stop Tony Abbott. That's the story of now. That's why we're here today. And that technique of organizing through story becomes incredibly powerful because there's sort of a secret reality to how campaigns work. So a lot of times when we read newspapers, when we consume media, the focus is on ads, right? Sort of the focus is on one-way communication. How do you find the right person who you want to vote and deliver the right message to them so that they get out in the polls and vote for your candidate? That's sort of what we hear about a lot. In the US context, we hear a lot about micro-targeting, right? Hit the 25-year-old college student with a message about education, hit the 50-year-old woman with a message about abortion, hit somebody else with something else, and together you'll get people to the polls. The reality of organizing, the reality of campaigns, is that the number one most trusted way to get somebody to vote for your candidate is to have someone they know come to their door, make a phone call, send them a letter, reach out to them personally to get them to the polls. That's what works. What works is a personal touch from someone in your social network, or if not that, somebody who lives in your community, or somebody who you can relate to. What organizing along story does is it allows us to expand that network. To say, I might not know this person, but because I've heard their story, I've shared my own story, we've identified that we actually have a collective story, and we both understand the collective moment we're in. We now trust each other. We can build a relationship that allows us to go out and organize together, allows us to generate volunteers, and allows us to turn out each other to the polls. So what does that mean in action? That's sort of So one of the interesting organizing tools that we've done at Move On, that President Obama did in South Carolina and in Iowa, and that I did in my campaign that I want to share with you, and then we'll open up to questions, is this. So I jumped into a congressional race where we needed about 14,000 votes to win. I jumped in with no name recognition, barely any name pronounceability, where I grew up, and had a task of finding 14,000 voters who were willing to commit to a young candidate, a candidate who they weren't sure about because they hadn't known for decades, but with whom they shared values. And so the main technique we used was we did something called house parties. Sounds like a simple concept. You get 20 or 30 people in a room, and you have a conversation about what's at stake, you answer questions, and you engage. But the thing I want to share is why organizing becomes so powerful. So what we did with our house parties was we identified one supporter. And this is similar to a model that worked at the presidential level, but can scale up or scale down very quickly. So we would identify one supporter in a small town, a suburb, wherever you were, and ask them to open up their doors to an event. And all the event would be is 20 or 30 people who have some coffee, have some chips, do whatever they wanted, have a conversation. Now, the reason that becomes powerful is now you have not just 20 or 30 people in a room talking to you, listening to you, signing up to volunteer, but now we have a host who's a committed messenger for the campaign. And what we asked the host to do was to come up with a list of 30 to 40 friends they knew and invite them to come. So now all these folks who don't live and breathe politics every single day like all of us in this room actually had a friend invite them to come to a political event, right? And what do you say when a friend invites you to come to a political event when you'd rather be out doing something else? You say, sure, because my friend invited me to come, right? And there might be some good beer, so I'll come and participate. And so we get 20 or 30 people in the door who didn't come to see me. They had no idea who I was. Most of them had somewhere else they'd rather be. But they came because their aunt or their sister or their dentist invited them to come out. And by coming, they didn't want to come alone, right? Because who wants to come alone to a political event where you know no one else? They would invite 2 or 3 friends. So suddenly I would show up week after week, 5 or 6 times a day on the weekends, to a packed house of 40 or 50 people. We would have the conversation, have them participate. And then afterwards, we'd ask them to volunteer. And what we found is the person who planned the house party was now a super volunteer, right? They'd done all the work we need them to do for the next 6 months. They'd reached out to 50 friends. They'd sent invitations. They'd made follow-up phone calls. They'd opened up their house. They'd had a whole event. Plus, we found that the people who brought their friends, they were active volunteers as well. So now we came out of this not just with 50 conversations, not just with 20 volunteers, but 6 super active volunteers who went back, were willing to go out, make phone calls, knock on doors, and do all that work. Now the reason this is powerful is because this all scales up. Because at the end of the day, our job is to get a certain number of voters to the polls. And even in Australia with compulsory voting, right, there's some percentage of people who are registered in the wrong place, so we got to get them to re-register. There's some percentage of people who will just forget there's an election and will face the fine if they don't hear from us. And so the challenge is fundamentally the same. The challenge we have is get the word out about Simon's campaign, get a lot of people to hear about Simon, get a large percentage of them to do what you're doing, to commit to volunteering, commit to being messengers who can then recruit other people to do this. Because at the end of the day, the way we win campaigns is by organizing, by getting more people out there talking to more voters in their own communities who they know, right? So I want to close with just one sort of more less field example, but I think is relevant for how this actually plays out. So one of the things we did at Move On this year is we took this to the next level and we sort of said, okay, we know that sort of collective friend-based accountability works because we know that people actually trust their friends not just for who to vote for, but reminders to go to vote. And so what we did in the States this year is we ran a massive program where we sent a postcard to every single voter who we knew sort of was leaning for Obama but might not show up at the polls. And all the postcard said, based on data that's available, and it's available here as well, as I understand it, is your percentage of elections that you turned out in for the past 10 years. So if you'd only voted in the last 3 out of 5 elections for some reason, we would give you a grade. We'd give you a C. Right? If you voted in all 5, you'd get an A. And we thought, this is great. We'll send people a postcard that says they're great. And as we did some early experiments on it, we found there's actually one more thing we could do that made it more powerful. Instead of just doing that, we actually compared your score to all your neighbors. So what we did is you got a postcard that said, your grade is an A, the average grade on your street is a C. Now, if you got that postcard, you felt good. On the other hand, if you got a postcard that said the average grade in your neighborhood is a C, but you get a D minus, well, you can imagine how that felt. And so we scaled up this model of social pressure, so people knew that their friends, their family, their neighbors were watching their voting patterns. And we radically increased voter turnout. We saw in tests and otherwise that people didn't want to be the person who filled the polls. But more than that, they didn't want their neighbors to know. And that's the key to organizing. The key to organizing is that we know that at the end of the day, people won't admit this, but they care what their friends think. They care what their family members think. They care what their community thinks. And our job is to reach as many of those people as possible, face to face, get them excited about a campaign like Sheyman's that promises fundamental change, and then get them to invest in the campaign, get them to become messengers in the campaign, because if we do that, we ultimately get more voters to the polls and we win. That's, at the end of the day, the lesson of the Obama campaign, lesson of my congressional campaign, lesson of campaigns all across the states, that at a time when you spend more and more money out on messages going out in the world, it's those deeper personal relationships, the social networking, that yes, you can do through Facebook, yes, you can do through mail, but you can also do through one-on-one conversations that actually moves votes, that gets voters to the polls. And that in the last minute, when somebody starts tossing negative attack ads, when they start saying negative things, the ability for those volunteers to call a voter they've already knocked on their door, they've already talked to, they've already had a conversation with, and say, that's just not true. Sheyman didn't do those terrible things 20 years ago. That's how we keep those votes, right? Because we know that comes at the end of the day. And so I'm going to pause there. I'd actually love to just answer questions that are more interesting to you in particular, but I think the key lesson we found in the States is that if you get a base of people who are willing to go out and organize, willing to have direct one-to-one conversations at the door, on the phone, with people in their own community as much as possible, that's where power is built. That's where you get people on board with the campaign. That's how you hold them in the campaign. That's how you get newly registered voters to remember when election day is. Remember, they're newly registered for a reason. And that's something that you win. So let me stop there, and we can go to questions.